For thousands of years, the horse was the supreme weapon on the battlefield, with just a single massed cavalry charge capable of winning battles and even entire wars in the blink of an eye, as even the most disciplined soldiers felt their courage falter and crumble in the face of such a terrifying and irresistible assault. Yet perhaps an even more unstoppable force is time itself. The onward march of human progress, ultimately rendering all things obsolete, no matter how indisputable their power and importance might once have been. It would be in defiance of an ever-changing and advancing world that man's stubborn unwillingness to abandon the old ways in the face of progress would see cavalry charges carried out in the most unusual settings, with often deadly results, where the traditions and tactics of the old world were often exposed as being woefully inadequate when arrayed against the incredible killing potency of modern weaponry. Yet, just occasionally, these relics of a dying era could still overcome the odds stacked against them and remind the world why cavalry charges were so feared for so long. Number 5. The Charge of the Savoy Cavalry. The Second World War was not only a period of incredible suffering, strife, and bloodshed, but also of unmatched technological advancement, as spurred on by the pursuit of a nation's very existence. The brightest minds in the world worked tirelessly to seek out any advantage over their enemies that might turn the tide of battle. In an environment of such rapid technological progress, the last tactic an officer on the ground might expect to encounter would be the now archaic massed cavalry charge of centuries past. However, during a relatively minor skirmish on the Eastern Front, the Italian Savoy Cavalry would carry out one of the last large-scale successful cavalry charges against their shocked Soviet adversaries. While fighting on the Eastern Front was generally dominated by clashes between German and Soviet troops, Axis forces were also comprised of men from all over the planet. Large numbers of volunteers were drawn from sympathetic Eastern European populations, with even Norwegian and French units seeing action in what was now a pan-European war against Soviet Bolshevism. As part of this international fighting force, Benito Mussolini dispatched some 235,000 Italian troops to the Eastern Front to serve alongside his German allies during the invasion of the USSR. However, the unfortunate men sent to what was perhaps the largest meat grinder in the history of warfare quickly realized that they were ill-equipped for the job. The men largely trained and fitted for mountainous fighting, their experience far removed from the challenges presented by the landscape and weather of the open steppes of the East. The German High Command had little faith in their Italian allies, with Mussolini's expeditionary force largely relegated to service in a support capacity. However, on the harsh Eastern Front, few would escape the horrors unfolding. As Axis forces advanced on Stalingrad, the Soviets saw their chance to hit back and counterattacked near the Don River, attempting to exploit a gap that had opened up between German and Italian troops and thus prevent the two forces from joining up, surrounding and destroying them separately rather than fighting them as one unified force. The Italian 2nd Infantry Division was the main target, and quickly proved themselves to be the weak link, falling back in the wake of the Soviet offensive. After just 2 days of combat, the Italians were utterly routed. Calamity now loomed for the Axis forces. If the Soviet counterattack continued unchecked, Red Army troops would be able to flank and ultimately envelop both the German and Italian armies, a turn of events that would prove catastrophic for the planned Axis advance on Stalingrad. In a desperate last-ditch effort to stave off disaster, the Savoy Cavalry Regiment was sent in as a relief force, with orders to block the Soviet advance at the small village of Izbushenki. Their target was an elevated position known simply as Hill 2135. By occupying and holding this strategic location, the men of the Savoy Cavalry might somehow be able to hold off the Soviet advance until reinforcements could arrive. However, the bleakness of the situation was difficult to ignore, even for the most optimistic. Under the command of a staunchly traditionalist Italian count named Colonel Alessandro di Casago, the Savoy cavalry set up camp just 1,000 meters from their objective, ready to occupy it the next morning. However, during the night, 2 Soviet battalions covertly took the hill, fortifying themselves in an arc facing the Italian camp, ready to launch a surprise attack at first light. At around 3:30 a.m. on August the 24th, an Italian reconnaissance patrol stumbled upon the concealed enemy position, robbing the Soviets of the element of surprise. With their plan in shambles, the Soviets dropped all pretense at stealth and subterfuge and opened fire on the Italian camp with all the weaponry at their disposal. With just 600 men under his command, Colonel Casago knew that a prolonged exchange of fire with an enemy that outnumbered him almost 4-1 would be foolish. The longer he waited, the worse his situation would become, as his numbers steadily dwindled away to incoming enemy fire. With defense no longer a viable option, and with retreat only likely to encourage the Soviets to pursue more aggressively, Colonel Casago decided that his only option was to go on the offensive, believing that if he could flank the enemy and attack with enough force, they might rout. For thousands of years, military commanders had forced enemies from the field with a decisive cavalry charge. Why could such a tactic not also work now? The colonel's mind was set. While charging cavalry head-on into modern weapons fire would almost certainly end in defeat and death, the colonel was aware that directly to the left of the Soviet-occupied hill lay an area concealed by the surrounding terrain. As this position lay far closer to the Soviet front line, charging from here would be far more likely to succeed. While the Soviets were distracted with the running battle, he covertly moved several of his cavalry squadrons to the concealed area to the left of the hill. With all the pieces required for his bold strategy now in place, the mounted Italians drew their sabres and prepared their hand grenades as the order to advance was given. Moving slowly at first so as not to tire the horses, the pace quickened as the enemy came into view, Captain de Leon eventually giving the final order to charge. The stunned Soviets barely had time to open fire before the unbreakable wave of flesh and steel crashed into their lines, the Italians slashing with their sabres and hurling their hand grenades at the enemy. While initially stunned at the sight of hundreds of horses galloping towards them, the Soviets quickly turned their fire upon this new and unusual foe, gunning down dozens of men and horses, many of which are said to have carried on charging for hundreds of meters, despite being riddled with bullets, carried forward by sheer momentum and adrenaline, before finally succumbing to death. Seeing that the first charge to the flank had hit home successfully, Colonel Casago ordered more squadrons to charge forward at the enemy center in support, the Soviet lines eventually breaking under the weight of the ferocious Italian attack and running for their lives. Against all the odds, a simple and seemingly outdated cavalry charge had routed a modern military force armed with explosives and automatic weaponry, winning a small but decisive victory that has gone down as one of the more unusual encounters of the Second World War. The day belonged to the men of the Savoy cavalry, however, with 32 of their number dead, a further 52 wounded, and over 100 horses lost, the price paid in blood had been steep. Against the horrific reality of warfare on the Eastern Front, and with the disastrous siege of Stalingrad looming on the horizon, the battle was little more than a minor skirmish that had bought time for other routed Axis units in the area to regroup. However, as one of the last full-scale cavalry charges in history, and a successful one to boot, the memory and legend of the Savoy cavalry was secured. Number 4. The Charge at Audreny. When Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th, 1914, the expeditionary force that arrived in France was led by officers who had received 19th century training and experience. As far as the generals were concerned, this war would unfold in the same way as all others previously had. However, this outdated strategic mindset would prove to have disastrous and deadly consequences for the men under their command, the ordinary soldier in the trenches, paying the ultimate price for their archaic tactics and refusal to rapidly respond to the changing face of warfare, the shell-scarred, muddy fields of northern France, proving to be not just the final resting place for hundreds of thousands of men, but also the graveyard of the old world. Within days of the declaration of war, the British Expeditionary Force took up positions around the small French town of Mons, ready to advance into Belgium as part of a large-scale Allied offensive. The 75,000-strong British force, equipped with 300 artillery pieces, was heavily outnumbered and outgunned by the 150,000 men and 600 artillery of the German First Army opposing them, and although the well-trained, professional and experienced British Army performed well and inflicted heavy losses on their German enemies with their murderously accurate rifle fire, eventually sheer numbers began to take their toll, and when the French allies on their flank were forced to retreat, the British position became untenable. The first major battle of the war had not gone well for the Allies, and a general order to withdraw was issued, with the Allies planning to regroup southeast from the Belgian frontier toward the Marne River. With the Germans in hot pursuit, the exhausted British Expeditionary Force fell back in generally good order, despite issues with communications failing to reach their targets in time. However, as the retreat continued, the 5th Division became separated from the British Cavalry Division and the 19th Brigade, leaving the 5th Division dangerously vulnerable to a large force of German troops eagerly advancing on their exposed flank from the west. At midday, the threatened 5th Division urgently requested assistance from the Cavalry Division to their south, with Lieutenant Colonel Campbell of the 9th Lancers ordered to deliver a mounted charge into the right flank of the attacking Germans near the village of Audreny, in a desperate effort to halt their advance and save the isolated 5th Division from being cut off. At this early stage of the war, cavalry was still being used in the traditional manner despite rapid advancements in modern weaponry, with mounted charges against infantry still considered to be not only a viable strategy but also a highly effective one. Yet it would be near the small town of Audreny that a minor skirmish would prove this thinking to be dangerously outdated, as a deadly combination of trench warfare, barbed wire, heavy artillery and machine guns exposed just how vulnerable cavalry had now become. The industrial-scale slaughter of the modern battlefield would render all romantic notions of the classic cavalry charge obsolete. Led by Captain Francis Grenfell, the 9th Lancers confidently galloped towards the German line, their minds perhaps filled with visions of glory and victory. However, such ideals were about to be ruthlessly snuffed out. Finding themselves in an open field facing an unbroken line of German machine guns and artillery, the 9th Lancers charged towards the German position. However, before they could come within striking distance of their foe, lines of sharp, barbed wire brought their thunderous charge to an early halt, the men and horses now becoming sitting ducks for the ruthless wave of incoming German machine gun and artillery fire. As shells exploded around them and bullets filled the air, the ranks of the 9th Lancers were quickly decimated, with Grenfell himself wounded as dozens of his men lay dead around him. Instead of a sweeping charge to glory like cavalry attacks of the past, the British assault was efficiently halted and smothered by the cold, killing power of modern machinery, the mounted soldiers still alive lucky to have escaped with their lives, let alone cutting down swathes of fleeing Germans with their sabres as they might have imagined and hoped. While a minor skirmish with relatively little loss of life, the charge at Audreny was an early demonstration of the new reality of war and a stark harbinger of things to come. Faced with deep trenches, barbed wire, artillery and machine guns, cavalry and courage alone were no longer sufficient to turn the tide of battles, a fact which even Captain Grenfell himself now accepted, writing just a few weeks later, "I am afraid all the cavalry traditions are forever ended, and we have become mounted infantry pure and simple, with very little mounted about it." Like much of the British Expeditionary Force that arrived in France in the opening days of the war, Captain Grenfell was killed in action just a year later, the small professional fighting force wiped out and replaced by the massed ranks of poorly trained civilian volunteers and conscripts that now filled the armies of Europe as more and more men were thrown into the meat grinder of trench warfare. Number 3. The Charge at Beersheba. In the penultimate year of the Great War, the most successful cavalry charge of the entire conflict took place not amidst the mud and gore of the battle-scarred fields of northern France, but upon the sun-scorched deserts of Palestine, when during an attack on the strategically important town of Beersheba, 800 bayonet-wielding Australian cavalrymen were ordered to charge the Ottoman trenches head-on in one of the last examples of how the terrifying speed and shock power of the massed cavalry charge can overcome even the most entrenched foe. This risky gamble in the face of machine guns and artillery, finally breaking the long and costly stalemate in the Middle East and opening up the rest of the Holy Land to the advancing Allies. Although generally sidelined by the events unfolding in Western Europe, the Middle Eastern theatre of war was no less crucial, the region home to the strategically important Suez Canal, which linked the Red Sea with the Mediterranean, the route through which the bountiful resources of the British Empire flowed. As the war progressed, Ottoman incursions into Egypt threatened the canal, and thus the very lifeblood of the British Empire. The Ottoman Empire's power in the Middle East had to be neutralized and the canal secured, or Britain and her allies would be starved of the resources required to continue waging war in Europe. Yet breaking the Ottomans would be no easy task. A formidable 50-kilometer defensive line stretching from the coastal city of Gaza to the small town of Beersheba in the south barred Allied entry into Palestine. The British had twice tried to punch through the Ottoman defences at the heavily fortified city of Gaza and had twice been repelled with severe losses. When General Edmund Allenby took command of the Allied Egyptian Expeditionary Force in June of 1917, he had been given clear instructions by the British Prime Minister to capture Jerusalem by Christmas. It was clear that if such a feat were to be accomplished, a change in strategy would be required. Focus shifted from Gaza in the north to the smaller town of Beersheba at the southern end of the Ottoman line. Although a strategically important position, Beersheba was a far softer target than the heavily fortified city of Gaza. Just 1,000 troops garrisoned the town, with another 3,000 in the surrounding areas, and although defended by a series of trenches and elevated redoubts, crucially the Ottoman trenches were not protected by barbed wire to the east, thus leaving the path open for any commander daring enough to unleash his cavalry against the enemy. Through secrecy and deception, the Ottomans were tricked into thinking that the next British attack would again be focused upon Gaza, while Allied forces were covertly moved towards Beersheba itself to avoid the enemy reinforcing the town's garrison. Incredibly, the ruse worked, as the 40,000-strong desert-mounted corps successfully made the long 43-kilometer trek through the desert undetected, marching under cover of darkness to avoid enemy scouts, eventually arriving near Beersheba on the 30th of October, 1917. Now sighted by the town's Ottoman defenders, it was crucial that Beersheba be swiftly captured within 24 hours to prevent the outnumbered Ottomans from destroying the town's precious wells, water which would be sorely needed, as many of the troops had gone over 24 hours with little to drink in the scorching heat of the desert sun due to dwindling supplies and distance from a suitable water source. At dawn the following day, the Allied attack commenced. All paths into Beersheba were cut off to prevent any reinforcements arriving and block their retreat, while the town and surrounding area was subjected to an intense artillery bombardment as Allied forces crept cautiously closer. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the Ottoman troops nevertheless resisted with intense ferocity, making the British forces pay dearly for every inch of ground, slowing their advance and burning precious hours as sunset ominously drew closer and closer. By mid-afternoon, the situation had become precarious indeed. The town and its precious wells had to be taken by the end of the day, or men and horses would begin to perish in the face of another night without water. Yet the slow and steady advance that had been taking place all day was simply not gaining ground fast enough. A rapid, all-out assault to overwhelm the enemy was required. Luckily, the British-led forces had just the right tool for such a job. Brigadier General William Grant ordered the 4th Australian Light Horse Brigade to form up and prepare to charge the Ottoman trenches defending Beersheba head-on. The Australian Light Horse would traditionally use their mounts to rapidly advance on an enemy position before dismounting for combat. However, fighting on foot on the open plains around Beersheba would leave them dangerously exposed to incoming enemy fire, and with perhaps just an hour of daylight left, would simply take too long. General Grant instead decided to utilize the Australians as traditional cavalry, ordering his men to unfix their bayonets and instead wield them as makeshift sabres, charging straight into and over the Ottoman trenches in the hopes that such a rapid and overwhelming assault might break the enemy before they had a chance to effectively respond. While charging trenches protected by machine guns and artillery might have seemed like a strategy that was doomed to fail, the general knew full well from aerial reconnaissance that the Ottoman trenches were not protected by barbed wire, and so if the gap could be closed fast enough, and if the British artillery could silence the Ottoman guns precisely enough, a cavalry charge could still work. The gamble was on. The Australians would have to cross over 4 miles of open ground under constant fire, advancing on enemy positions that were by now largely shrouded by a choking cloud of dust and smoke that had been thrown into the air by the day's fighting. However, if they could move swiftly enough, they might be able to catch the Ottomans off guard, with the soldiers manning the trenches unlikely to be expecting a cavalry charge, instead anticipating that the Australians would dismount and fight on foot once within rifle range. 800 horsemen mounted up and galloped towards the enemy, accelerating into a full charge as they came within a mile of the Ottoman trenches. Unprepared for a full-on charge, the Ottoman artillery gunners overshot their targets, anticipating that the cavalrymen would slow down their pace to dismount. However, the charge moved forward at full steam, with some accounts suggesting that the horses were driven forward in a frenzy by the smell of the water in the town. Before they could unleash a second and more accurate barrage, the now exposed Ottoman artillery positions were swiftly silenced by the observant British artillery, who accurately honed in and destroyed the remaining Ottoman guns. As the distance was closed, Ottoman machine guns and rifles opened fire. However, the speed of the charge was so great that there was barely enough time to unleash more than a couple of inaccurate, panic-stricken volleys before the wild-eyed, bayonet-wielding Australians reached their target. Hundreds of horsemen simply jumped over the trenches and charged straight into the town, capturing the precious wells before the enemy had a chance to destroy them, while hundreds more dismounted and attacked the Ottoman trenches from the rear, the now demoralized and terrified Ottoman soldiers said to have lost all control of fire discipline. It was here that the combat descended into a brutal hand-to-hand fight for survival, as the Australians stabbed and slashed at their foes with their bayonets and clubbed them to death with their rifles. Some of the horsemen would later comment on how their horses died beneath them, seemingly for no reason, only for the rider to later discover that the horse's stomach had been ripped open by Ottoman bayonets as they had leapt over the trenches. Despite suffering at the hands of one of the last great charges in history, many of the Ottomans fought fiercely and bravely, dying at their posts rather than fleeing. However, despite such a heroic sacrifice, the town was completely overrun within just 10 minutes of the charge reaching the trenches, as British infantry poured in from all sides to secure victory. Despite facing such deadly resistance, only 31 Australians and 70 horses died during the charge, compared to as many as 500 Ottomans, with a further 1,500 taken prisoner, a statistic which shows just how effective the tactic had been. The speed and surprise of the mounted assault, overcoming formidable defences that would have likely caused far greater Allied casualties had a conventional infantry assault been carried out. The charge had defeated the enemy in just 10 minutes, capturing the town's crucial wells before nightfall and finally breaking the long stalemate in the region. punching a hole in the Ottoman line that would quickly be exploited by Allied forces, with the long-contested city of Gaza falling just a week later, and Jerusalem itself captured on the 9th of December 1917, well before the Christmas deadline given to General Allenby by the British Prime Minister. Number 2. The Battle of Krojanty. Throughout history, Polish cavalry has been one of the most potent and feared fighting forces on the battlefield. A single charge from these elite warriors, capable of turning the tide of a battle and even altering the history of the entire world. However, despite being responsible for some of the most famous and influential charges in military history, Polish cavalry would also see action on the mechanized battlefields of World War II. Where centuries after, the legendary winged hussars swept aside the invading Ottomans and saved Vienna, Polish cavalry would carry out several conventional and successful charges against the invading German army. However, despite such successes, perhaps the most well-known Polish cavalry charge of World War II was actually a myth spread for the benefit of Axis propaganda. Slander designed to portray the Poles as incompetent, backward, and poorly led. Lies created to conceal the truth about their formidable courage and fighting prowess. When the Second World War began in 1939, cavalry was still very much an integral part of the Polish army. The First World War in the East and the war between Poland and the Soviets in 1919 had time and time again proved the value of a professional mounted infantry, the region's wide open plains coupled with its scarce road network proving to be the ideal backdrop for the maneuverability offered by horses. However, Polish commanders knew full well the changing reality of war, and by 1939 the standard charge was no longer considered to be a viable strategy. In fact, the spear had been withdrawn from service 3 years earlier, and sabres were considered a weapon of last resort. The modern Polish cavalryman was armed with anti-tank weapons, light and heavy machine guns, as well as a variety of other modern weapons of war. This well-trained and highly mobile warrior, using their steed to quickly close ground and deploy wherever their firepower was needed most, dismounting for combat where they would engage the enemy as ordinary infantrymen. Yet despite utilizing conventional tactics that were used by armies all over the world, amidst the chaos of war, the proud Polish cavalry would find themselves fall victim to a vicious smear campaign. The origins of this persistent myth can be found on the very first day of the war, when a Polish cavalry regiment spotted a force of some 800 German infantry resting in a forest clearing near the village of Krojanty. Realizing that they could take the invading Germans by surprise, Colonel Mastalers ordered 2 squadrons of about 250 men to charge the enemy, the saber-wielding cavalry falling upon the surprised German infantrymen before they had a chance to organize any kind of effective defense. The Poles rampaged through the forest clearing, eagerly cutting down dozens of Germans as the enemy crumbled and routed, fleeing for their lives. Yet, just as though it seemed as if the day had been won, misfortune struck as a group of German armoured cars stationed nearby heard the commotion and entered the fray, opening fire on the Polish cavalry with their mounted machine guns and autocannons. Against such withering fire, the exposed Polish cavalry stood no chance and were quickly cut to pieces as they were forced to flee for cover under heavy fire. In a matter of minutes, 1/3 of the Poles were killed, including Commander Mastalers. Yet what was a relatively minor skirmish would soon be seized upon by the Germans, who at this early stage of the war were eager to portray their Polish enemies in a less than flattering light. The next day, several war correspondents were invited to the site of the battle for an impromptu press conference. The eager journalists fed the entirely false narrative that the Poles had foolishly launched a cavalry charge against German armoured vehicles in what was supposedly a clear example of German technological and tactical superiority against a backward, poorly led, irrational, and inferior Eastern European enemy. One of the Italian journalists present released an article in which he claimed to have been an eyewitness to the charge, writing for a now global audience about how the Poles had bravely but recklessly charged their horses against a German panzer division in an act of desperation and plain stupidity, their swords and lances useless against the armour and machine gun fire of the highly advanced German vehicles. The fabricated story proved to be a hit with audiences and spread around the world like wildfire, with even Time magazine and the New York Times reproducing the myth, the tale of the brave but foolish Polish cavalry clinging on to obsolete and outdated traditions in the face of the modern world, seemingly capturing the public's imagination and proving highly valuable to the German propaganda machine, which was already doing its best to portray the Poles as a backward nation that needed to be crushed and absorbed into the expanding Third Reich. Even after the war had ended, the myth continued to be peddled by the Soviets, who had now installed an unpopular puppet communist government in Poland that was doing everything it could to discredit the old Polish Republic. The new Soviet-backed government eagerly using the tale of the charge as an example of the incompetence and stupidity of Poland's pre-war leadership, the uncaring capitalists willing to throw away the lives of their soldiers by stubbornly using outdated tactics and technology. Yet the reality of the situation was far removed from such lies. At the beginning of the war, the Polish cavalryman was a well-trained and elite, highly mobile infantryman who would consider the prospect of charging enemy armoured units to be simply absurd, and all of the 16 confirmed Polish cavalry charges of September 1939 were against vulnerable enemy infantry, the majority of which ended in victory for the attacking Polish cavalry. Number 1. The Battle of Haifa. In the closing days of the Great War, an Indian cavalry brigade serving in the British Army would carry out one of the last successful cavalry charges in history when the men of the Jodhpur Lancers cut their way through the Ottoman defenders of the city of Haifa, their lances and sabres coupled with their bravery and resolve, overcoming the well-defended enemy's machine guns and artillery in one of the clearest examples of how the shock power of the cavalry charge was still a force to be reckoned with, even in the modern age. During the First World War, over 1 million Indian soldiers fought for the Allies across all theatres of war, with over 74,000 losing their lives in battle. One component of this million-man Indian force was the Jodhpur Lancers, a brigade of cavalry formed by Pratap Singh, the third son of the Maharaja Takhat Singh, the ruler of the princely state of Jodhpur in northwestern India. Initially created as a private army of 60 followers funded by his father, the Jodhpur Lancers were expanded into a unit of 300 men, following the colonial Indian government's request that each princely state raise men to serve with the imperial army. Backed by the fabulous wealth of the Maharaja, the Jodhpur Lancers were one of the finest equipped and well-presented units of men in the entire army, the cavalrymen whose motto was simply "I obey," seeing action against Indian rebels, and even taking part in putting down the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900. Yet when the Great War began in 1914, Pratap Singh sensed the potential laurels to be won, immediately offering to take his Jodhpur Lancers to France. Yet even when he was advised that cavalry charges were unlikely to be utilised, he confidently replied, "I will make an opportunity." One way or another, he would find a way to lead his Lancers in a charge to glory against the enemy. Arriving in France in October of 1914, the Jodhpur Lancers saw minor action on the Western Front for 3 years, yet the opportunity to charge the enemy evaded them. However, in early 1918, they were redeployed to the Allied Egypt Expeditionary Force, an army tasked with fighting off the Ottoman attempt to capture the Suez Canal and cut Britain off from her vast and lucrative empire. Although now 73 years old, Pratap Singh still rode with his men on horseback and camped in the desert at night, his quest for a glorious charge against the enemy driving him ever forward. It would be in the final weeks of the war, on September 23, 1918, that Pratap Singh and his men would finally get the opportunity they had waited so many years for. The Imperial Service Cavalry Brigade that the Jodhpur Lancers were assigned to was ordered to take the strategically important city of Haifa. However, achieving this objective would be no small feat. The entire area was heavily fortified, with Ottoman troops dug in at the front of the town, supported by German and Austrian artillery on the hills above. Although an assault on the enemy position was likely to inflict high casualties, the objective simply had to be taken if the Egyptian expeditionary force was to continue advancing into Ottoman-controlled territory, as capturing Haifa would open up its port to the Allies and allow the rapid delivery of desperately needed supplies. Another Indian cavalry unit known as the Mysore Lancers was tasked with ascending the slopes of Mount Carmel to neutralize the Austrian battery of light field guns threatening the plains below, while the Jodhpur Lancers were ordered to charge the rearguard of Ottoman and German machine gunners and take the town of Haifa itself. The 400 horsemen of the Jodhpur Lancers lined up and prepared to advance, as a well-entrenched enemy more than twice their number awaited their attack. The deadly machine guns hungrily pointed ahead, just waiting for the right moment to open fire and tear the approaching men and horses apart. To make matters worse, the Indians were without the charismatic and well-respected leader, as the elderly Pratap Singh had fallen ill with a fever the night before, leaving command of the Lancers to Major Dalpat Singh. As the Jodhpur Lancers charged towards the Ottoman position, they almost immediately came under heavy fire, a withering storm of bullets and artillery that claimed the life of Major Dalpat Singh in the opening moments of the charge. Enraged at the loss of their leader, the Indians pushed forward, weathering the storm of death that was enveloping them, until they finally reached the Ottoman lines and unleashed their pent-up anger and frustration, slashing with their sabres and thrusting their lances into any Ottoman soldier unfortunate enough to find himself within melee range. Shocked by the sheer violence and ferocity of the charge that had crashed into them, the Ottomans quickly broke ranks and fled for their lives, attempting to find sanctuary in the centre of the town. However, the Jodhpur Lancers were not about to simply sheathe their weapons and desist, and instead continued their charge straight into the town itself, cutting down all enemies in their path until they reached the town square. With the Mysore Lancers now joining the fray in support, the two cavalry units quickly captured Haifa as its defenders surrendered en masse rather than face the bloody points of the Indian lances. In a lightning-fast and ferocious charge, the Jodhpur Lancers had taken Haifa despite the odds stacked against them in less than 1 hour, capturing 1,350 German and Ottoman prisoners, along with 17 artillery guns and 11 machine guns, while losing just 8 of their own, with 34 wounded and 60 horses lost. To this day, the anniversary of the battle is still commemorated by the Indian Army, the celebration and remembrance ceremony known simply as Haifa Liberation Day, standing as a testament to the remarkable feat achieved by the Jodhpur Lancers over 100 years ago. So those are my choices for 5 of the last cavalry charges in history. Let me know which other cavalry charges you would have included in the list in the comments below, and I'll see you again on the next video.